In the last several segments, we talked about Hobbes's political philosophy. We also talked about his moral philosophy, his view that morality originates with contracts that are enforceable. You might think that Hobbes's view is entirely irrelevant to contemporary thinking. After all, you might think, well, the view that democracy is impossible or too risky might have seemed plausible at a time when monarchs ruled the day. These days, where many countries are successful and flourishing democracies, it seems pretty implausible to say democracy risks too greatly throwing us back into the war of all against all. You might also find other aspects of Hobbes's view implausible. For example, Hobbes seems to have a pretty negative view of human nature. He thinks we're not naturally predisposed to cooperate. And you might note that there's various aspects of contemporary cognitive psychology that suggest we do have some predisposition to cooperate, at least with people in our own group. You might also think that Hobbes's identification of law, justice, and morality is implausible. After all, didn't Martin Luther King Jr. argue persuasively that law is one thing and morality another, that some laws in fact are unjust? Given all of these differences between the way people think these days and the way Hobbes was thinking, you might think his view is entirely irrelevant. Well, in order to combat this, I think, misguided view, we're going to consider various threads of Hobbes's thinking that are alive and well today, and more generally, ways in which things Hobbes said are still plausible. So remember our starting issues. The first issue was, why should we have any government rather than none at all? Hobbes offers what's called a contract theory answer to this question. He says there's a social contract. The reason we should have some government rather than none at all is because we make a kind of contract to not harm one another, and that allows us to escape the war of all against all. You might sort of generalize away from the details of Hobbes's view and say the reason we should have some government rather than none at all is because a government allows for agreements between people, and agreements between people help us flourish. That kind of answer to the question, why should we have any government rather than none at all, is still the most popular answer. It's the answer accepted by the majority of people who think we should have a government. So that's one way in which Hobbes's thinking is influential. Now notice that this doesn't require that Hobbes be right about, say, we would be in a war of all against all if there were no government. And it doesn't require that he be right about the kind of government we should have, that we should have a single sovereign who's all-powerful. It just requires the minimal claim that the purpose of government is to help ensure that contracts are upheld, because having contracts that can be upheld help us all flourish. Again, that's the most popular answer to the question, why should we have some government rather than none? And Hobbes gives it a rather articulate defense. Now, the second question, which kind of government should we have? Hobbes says roughly a totalitarian dictatorship. That's not such a popular answer these days, certainly not in a country like the United States. Consequently, you might think, well, Hobbes gets a good answer to the first question, but a bad answer to the second. But it's important to note that very many elements of Hobbes' answer to this second question remain very influential. So aspects of the way in which he argues that we should have a totalitarian dictatorship are still present and still play a role in people arguing that democracy should go one or another way. In order to see this, we're going to consider various authoritarian tendencies in democracy, or broadly Hobbesian tendencies in democracy. So here's one. Hobbes was very concerned, as should be clear to you by now, about security. He thought that security is the fundamental political virtue. The point of a government is to ensure security, to keep us out of the war of all against all. And we should give up liberty. We should give up the right of nature and give up any particular liberties that we may need to give up in order to ensure security. This aspect of Hobbes' thinking is also clear when you remember what he said about when it's appropriate to rebel. He thought, so long as the government is making your life more secure than it would be in the war of all against all, you ought not rebel, even if the government is very oppressive and restricting your liberty in a wide variety of ways. So here's the point. Hobbes emphasizes security over liberty. And there's often a tension between security and liberty in democratic societies. Here are some examples of ways in which our society chooses security over liberty. One, mass incarceration. So, as you probably know, there's a lot of people in the United States who are incarcerated. That is, we have an incredibly large prison population. This is increased by year. You'll notice that between 1990 and 2000, we saw a massive jump in prison and number of people imprisoned. There's a variety of factors that drove this jump, including the crime bill that played a crucial role. Notice that the United States imprisons more people per capita than any other comparable country on Earth. So by comparable country, I mean countries that have high GDP, that are relatively wealthy, and so on. If you look down the list here, the first country that's sort of comparable in terms of wealth is maybe the United Kingdom, and they imprison far fewer people per person than we do. Well, how does this relate to Hobbes? The United Kingdom, it seems, is pushing against Hobbes. They're saying we care more about personal liberty than we do about security. We're willing to let more dangerous people or more criminals be on the street if it means protecting our liberties. Whereas in the United States, it looks like we're following more closely to Hobbes. We're saying we would rather have more criminals in prison and lose a little bit of liberty, not only their liberty for their criminal acts, but presumably the more people you have in prison, the more likely you are to be imprisoning innocent people. We'd rather give up a little bit on the liberty end to get more on the security end. And that's a very Hobbesian thought. Here's another example. Targeted assassination through drone strikes without trial. So this became official policy during the second Bush presidency, continued through Obama's presidency, and has continued into Trump's presidency. So a targeted assassination through a drone strike without trial means we pick particular people and use drones to assassinate them. Now, you might think this isn't relevant because only people who are US citizens have the right to trial, but in fact, we've used targeted assassination to kill US citizens without trial. And you might think that's a good thing. You might think it's a bad thing. Here, I'm not judging whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. What I want you to see is that if you think it's a good thing, and current government policy says it is, then you're emphasizing security over liberty. You're saying, we're willing to give up on some liberties, like the right to a trial, if it will increase our security by taking out people we think we're sufficiently confident are dangerous. So this is something Hobbes, like mass incarceration, Hobbes would be very much in favor of. He would be very much in favor of targeted assassination through drone strikes without trial, and in fact, that's a policy the US is implementing. Another example of an authoritarian tendency in democracy is to de-emphasize individual privacy and emphasize state and corporate secrets. So the idea is individuals' right to privacy should be limited, whereas the state should be able to do whatever it wants, including keep secrets. Well, in contemporary US society, as you probably know, there is very little right to privacy because we have mass surveillance. So Edward Snowden famously revealed that the NSA, the National Security Administration, and other intelligence agencies aim to collect every electronic communication worldwide, including every US citizen electronic communication. So every time you send a text message, make a Skype call, send an email, make a phone call, the NSA is aiming to collect that. Well, when Snowden leaked this, you can consider how various entities reacted. So some people were appalled, but many people were not appalled at the policies Snowden revealed, but rather appalled at the fact that Snowden had revealed them. So several members of Congress called for Snowden's execution. The Espionage Act of 1917 made it illegal for government officials to leak classified information to the press, and although Snowden was technically working for a private contractor at the time that he leaked these secrets, he was given access to government materials and had worked for the government. So some people said under this act he should be arrested. There's been many prosecutions under this act since 1917, but there have been few prosecutions under this act since 1917, and most of them were under Obama. I don't know if this is still right because I haven't looked at how many people have been prosecuted under this act in the Trump administration. I know of at least one case, but I don't know how many cases in total. So there may be more now, more under Trump than Obama, maybe fewer, I'm not sure. You could look that up if you're interested. But for our purposes, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that when people emphasize the right of the government to collect all of this information and de-emphasize individual privacy, they're making a very Hobbesian move. They're saying the state has more or less unlimited rights and individuals have very limited rights. Here's another example. Asking for obedience to people in power in the state. So remember, Hobbes thinks that there should be an all-powerful leader and that everyone in society should just submit to the leader. And there are tendencies in democracies to ask for obedience to people in power and to the state. I won't run through examples here, but you can perhaps think of some on your own. Finally, Hobbes thought you should emphasize having a really strong military and police force, right? If your main concern is that society will slip into a war of all against all, then of course you think that society should be set up such that you have a massive military and a massive police force in order to ensure security, in order to prevent slipping back into the war of all against all. And again, in the United States today, there's a lot of emphasis on military and security spending. So here's a chart showing up through 2017, fiscal year 2017, how much money was spent on national defense budget. Here's a chart comparing what the US spends on national defense budgets compared to other big spenders. You can see that the US spending is much, much higher. Well, if Hobbes looked at this chart, he would say that the US is doing what it should, that the US is in fact the only successful country on this list, because the US is ensuring the security of its nation against other nations, and presuming that the military spending is indicative of spending on local security, it's also doing what it should locally. You can see that military spending for the US comprises the largest portion of the discretionary budget. The discretionary budget is the budget that can change from year to year and needs to be voted on from year to year. Other aspects of the federal government's budget aren't discretionary. That is, they're fixed over a longer period of time and don't need to be voted on each year. But when it comes to the discretionary budget, the military budget is greater than all the rest of the federal budget put together. And again, Hobbes would look at this chart and say, of course, and that's the way it should be, because the main function of a government should be to ensure the security of its citizens. And what better way to do that than by having a strong military? All these other things, ensuring that people can sort of get around or get education or get health care or whatever, are distant second, third, fourths, and so on to ensuring security and avoiding the war of all against all. Police spending, so this is for ensuring domestic security, is on the rise, and Hobbes would say that that's a wonderful thing, that police spending should be on the rise. Because again, it will help ensure security, even if it means tamping down on people's liberty. So there are a variety of authoritarian tendencies in democracy, or if you don't want to say authoritarian, we can say broadly Hobbesian tendencies in democracy. There are arguments that Hobbes used to suggest that we should have an authoritarian society, that people use to suggest that in our democracy we should have, say, a large military, very little right to privacy, government spying, government surveillance, heavy military spending, heavy police spending. So Hobbes's arguments are still very influential, even in our democratic society. These authoritarian tendencies, or broadly Hobbesian tendencies, are ways in which Hobbes's views still influence our world today. Next time, in the next segment, we'll consider further ways in which Hobbes's views still influence our world today.